All right, folks. Happy Friday. This is David Quam at Dentons, Washington, D.C., and this is our continuing Friday seminar series, updates on the coronavirus and COVID-19. Today's topic is going to focus both on the policy updates, both at the federal and state level, and then we're going to address a key legal issue and question for a lot of folks. That is the potential impact of the pandemic on privacy and data security. I'm David Quam. I'm going to start today with an overview of Dentons and what we're doing, and then we're going to look at some of the state, local, and federal policies. At Dentons, we are committed to really trying to serve our clients, our people, and our communities during this pandemic. The firm has been very active over the last several weeks, setting up multiple task forces, both within the firm and globally, to try to help serve clients and really get a complete picture from around the world. Dentons, as the world's largest law firm, has 183 offices in over 75 countries. We represent 25 different industry sectors with 40 different practice areas. We've been working to bring all of that expertise and all the people around the globe, many of which who have been in hot spots for the coronavirus over this past several weeks, to bring all that experience to bear for our clients in every country in the United States and every state where we serve folks. It is a pleasure to serve not only our clients, but also try to be leaders in our communities where we work and live. This ongoing commitment can be seen in some of the resources that we have provided. We have a COVID-19 hub, which if you've not been to, I do highly recommend. It provides resources both worldwide and for the United States. Those resources, and I'll talk about some of this in more detail later, include not just a look at in the United States at what's happening at the federal level, but what's happening legally, what's happening in commercial markets, and we have a 50-state tracker looking specifically at some of the executive orders offered by states. With that, let me give a quick policy overview of where we are this week. Although things have somewhat slowed from a policymaking standpoint, we still have a lot of activity going on. It's always worthwhile to first take a look at where we are in the United States. Although this is well documented, it's worth looking at where things are the hottest among the states with regard to both infections and moving forward. This, of course, is an issue in all 50 states and territories. Everyone is under emergency declaration and has been for some time. Everyone is dealing with the pandemic. As a lobbyist who works very closely with state governments, I know that governors are meeting twice a week with each other on phone calls, and the meeting also with the administration, trying to coordinate their activities. One of the biggest issues at the state level, and one of the biggest topics right now, is the question of reopening states. This is an overview of some of the latest announcements from states as they're taking a look at how can we restart the economy. Some of these have been very public, like those out of Georgia and South Carolina. Others have been a little slower to get out there in the public, but what you have is a lot of governors looking for how can they reopen their state economies, how can they do it safely with social distancing, slowly get their economies back open, and how do they do that in the safest way possible. The trends include starting to look at opening some non-essential businesses and retail, but doing it with some real restrictions with regard to social distancing and capacity within buildings. Most states have now closed schools for the year. So the K through 12 students will be, if they're working online, that will continue through the rest of their school year, with schools not reopening until next fall. And then you've got others looking at recreational activities, some of which are open, like state parks in South Carolina. But I also know that in South Carolina, all public pools and pool facilities are still closed. So the devil's in the details with regard to reopening, with regard to how quickly this is going to happen, and which states are going to both move first and when other states will begin to reopen. You also have a number of states who never actually went under a stay-at-home order. Those are listed below, including many states who have stayed open but tried to maintain social distancing. So this is going to be an evolving issue that moves ahead. For updates on where each of those states stand and some of the executive orders, I do recommend you go to our COVID-19 50 state tracker, in which we have used the resources of Dentons to pull together all the executive orders, agency orders, not only at the state level, but at the major urban or city level and the county level as well. Anyone who's doing business or really worried about these policy issues needs to track not only what's happening at the federal level, but very closely monitor the states and monitor your own local jurisdictions. This week, the big news coming out of Washington, D.C. was what we called phase 3.5. It is backfilling for some of the most popular programs that came out of the CARES Act. That was an over $2 trillion program. We have this week another $484 billion in money that came out from Washington, D.C. Most of it was used to keep the Paycheck Protection Program going. This is the very popular small business loan program that ran out of money about a week ago. This infusion of cash puts almost an equal amount back into that program. You've also got some policies which are pulling money back from some folks who got PPP protection or loans because they have access to the equity markets. This program is very fluid. If you're a small business that has applied, this infusion of funds is going to help serve a lot more people who were in the pipeline, but were not able to complete their application or the process before the money ran out in the first tranche. You also have $60 billion in economic disaster loans for small business. This is another very specific program through the SBA. Again, it's a bit more limited, but it offers a lot of protections for small businesses as well. And then you've got $75 billion in emergency relief for hospitals. This goes really to the first responders in dealing with the virus. And then $25 billion to ramp up testing nationwide. What I will note, there are several things in here that you do not see, including additional money for state and federal government or state and local governments who did get money under the CARES Act, but are looking for additional assistance as their revenue streams have crashed nationwide. If you don't have people going shopping, buying gas, flying or traveling, tourism, you can see that a lot of the income streams for state and local governments have been underwater and will remain there until the economy gets back up and going. Here at Dentons, what we are looking for is phase 4. There will be yet another package. It'll be debated for a longer period of time. It will include efforts to really jumpstart or restart the economy. That'll be a stimulus package, much more akin to what happened back in 2009 after the economy went into a recession. We are looking for money not only for state and local governments, but money for investment like in infrastructure, broadband, distance learning. A lot of the issues that have popped up with regard to this virus will be involved in the next package. What that looks like, Congress will start to determine when it returns. It looks like both the House and the Senate will be returning May 4th or 5th. Interestingly enough, Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas are still likely to be at stay-at-home orders when they come back. So I think we're going to see a lot of different lawmaking here in Washington, D.C. and a lot of different dynamics as lawmakers come back to decide how are we going to get this economy back up and rolling. For those of you who would like more information on any of that, please feel free to contact me or any member of the Dentons Public Policy team. We would be happy to help. With that, I'm going to turn to our distinguished panelists today. We have 3 leaders in Dentons of our technology and privacy practices. Todd Dobert is the lead of the U.S. Technology and Privacy Group out of Washington, D.C. Lauren Wilson is one of our associates who specializes in technology and privacy from the angle of the Federal Communications Commission. And then John McCauley is also helps lead our technology and privacy team out of Indianapolis, showing sort of the geographic diversity that we have here at Dentons and the breadth of expertise. With that, Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Wonderful, thank you. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So what we're finding with the pandemic is that it's serving to accelerate and to amplify any privacy and data security issues that different companies face. And I think what it really shows is the importance when it comes to privacy of viewing both the details and the bigger picture at the same time. It's too easy for some companies to view this as purely a cost driver and purely a compliance issue where you need to check the boxes. And I think that what you see is a pandemic can show that it's important not only to make sure that you actually are in compliance, but that you're communicating and that you're viewing this from the larger picture of this is how you connect to the public. This is how you communicate with lawmakers. This is how you communicate with regulators. This is actually how you grow market share and revenues. And what do I mean by that? I'll take as an example what's happened with Zoom. And by no means do I mean my comments here to be a criticism of them, but we've had several clients who, as a result of press reporting, whether it be accurate or inaccurate or incomplete, can lead to a lot of attention both by the public and by regulators. We have one client who had a press report about him, and it wound up with a 50-state investigation, SEC, FTC, and everybody at once. So companies like Zoom, in quiet times, the privacy and data security issues may not be noticed as quickly. But in the pandemic, focus can be intensified. And Zoom, for example, through a combination of various different factors, including the fact that people didn't necessarily understand how to even use the product, led to concern over their privacy practices and led to concern over their data security practices. And so it shows that in the quiet times and at all times, it's really important to take a look at how you're talking about what you do, what you're actually doing, making sure that you have the proper controls in place and making sure that you have the bigger picture covered so that when you get your chance to shine in the spotlight, it won't have negative consequences of people questioning whether you're doing the right things or that you are gaining the attention of regulators, because the pandemic puts pressure on regulators to really look into issues that they might otherwise not notice or not focus on as much. So I think that the main point that we'd like to make today is make sure when you think about privacy and data security that you're not only thinking about it in terms of compliance that maybe nobody's going to notice, but that you're also thinking about it in terms of ways to drive your market share, ways to gain customer trust, ways to make your users more sticky. And if you do that in the good times, it will help protect you in times like this when attention gets amplified. And I don't know, John, do you have any thoughts on this? I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, now that I'm unmuted, yeah, thank you, Todd. I do, especially as it has implications for the workplace and employee safety. One area where this has manifested itself is in the employment context. And I'm not trying to cover the entire waterfront here, but rather provide everybody with some ideas to start thinking about security and privacy under this new paradigm. The big issue that I see is employers are trying to balance the need to gather information to ensure workplace safety, while at the same time protecting employees' rights to privacy. It's not an easy task, and there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. Who would have thought 3 months ago that employers would be asking employees, tell us where you've been, tell us who you were with, tell us what you've been doing, and oh, by the way, give us the contact information for everybody that you came in contact with. Or employers requiring a temperature check and answering detailed questions about health and symptoms each time an employee enters a facility. Now, employers are in possession of much more data on employees than they normally would collect. And in addition, that data is very sensitive. One of the biggest challenges we want our folks to think about is to consider how all of this new data and various collection mechanisms are balanced against local laws, federal laws, employment practices, and even your employee handbooks. Is there a consistent message going to employees and to the public related to the data that companies have been collecting? In the United States, for example, employers would need to consider the interplay of recently acquired health data with Americans with Disability Act restrictions, the EEOC implications of collecting this data, and also OSHA requirements that are in place. We've worked with companies in the food processing industry who've had additional considerations as far as the U.S. Department of Agriculture goes. And employers will also need to mesh their privacy policies and the collection of this data with their standard and normal employment practices and policies. Again, are the employees receiving a consistent message? Is the public receiving a consistent message? Is our shareholders receiving a consistent message? But once we have all of this data, we have to ensure it is protected. And employers should consider whether the health data, for example, can be anonymized or de-identified while still accomplishing the original goal of safety in the workplace. Employers should also consider their physical, administrative, and technical controls in light of this new type of data. And what we've been seeing, especially for some organizations, is they now have a large amount of paper that they may not have had before. And they're trying to rethink how physical controls and access and those types of things. And so now that we have the data, what do we do with it? We have to make sure that only persons who have absolute need to know the information have access to the health data and take appropriate steps to limit that knowledge. Another consideration is requests for transfer of the data, for example, from public health officials who are asking for it, or even other corporate departments or members of the same corporation. What are they entitled to? What format? What about the security of the data transferred? Should you consider encryption and or use of multi-factor authentication when transmitting sensitive data? Other considerations might be if you're transferring from, for example, a European subsidiary to the United States, how does the GPR affect that transfer? And the last consideration is to think about what are we going to do with this data once the need to use it and store it no longer exists? Federal laws, local laws, those types of things. Good data hygiene practices should be considered, and best practices for disposing of of that data were allowed by law. Next, what I'm going to do is turn this over to Lauren Wilson, who will share her insights on artificial intelligence and its impact on policymaking. And if, Lauren, you have any thoughts on the employment context, please feel free to jump in there.
Thanks, John. Now, a lot of what John said about good hygiene is particularly relevant when it comes to AI applications. We're beginning to see several applications of artificial intelligence in response to the pandemic, and government officials and technologists are advocating for the deployment of AI for even more uses, as we get further along into, these unfortunate circumstances. For example, AI is being used for contact tracing to predict the location of outbreaks and to speed up drug discovery. There have also been reports of developing AI systems to assist individuals with applying for benefits and to help them manage their symptoms at home or take preventative measures to combat contraction of COVID-19 in the first place. Now, in the hands of good actors, all of these applications are incredibly efficient and useful. However, in the hands of bad actors, there's potential for negative outcomes that could really undermine the public's trust and therefore the ability to gather the data that's necessary to build these AI systems and manifest these very useful applications. In that vein, instead of contact tracing, data could be used for locating organizers or political opposition when in the hands of bad actors. Therefore, it's important to think about what sort of safeguards are we putting in place to protect personal information and instill confidence in the public. For businesses, this means, ensuring that there is a sufficient legal basis for gathering the underlying data sets and for implementing AI. And so you have to think really carefully about what changes you need to make in your business and the way you collect information and how are you using it. Is it sufficiently communicated, in your privacy policies and under the rules of a given jurisdiction? And, I think once you get a handle on that, there's a real opportunity here to, progress the conversation about privacy and AI forward. This pandemic can really accelerate consideration of new uses for data and for AI, and to really make AI a part of, of comprehensive response, not only to the pandemic, but to, future policy problems. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Todd and David to talk more about the future of data sharing and other policy implications.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And thanks to the audience. We could spend the whole time on any one of these subjects. So we appreciate that we're just hitting the top edge. And, I'd say for today that, the pandemic is going to have very real impacts on the way we approach privacy, data collection, use, and sharing. And I think those impacts are going to be radically different in different regions. And I'll give you an example. In Europe, privacy is viewed as a fundamental human right, which means that the government has a duty to protect you. Even when you would be willing to engage or allow something to happen, they have a duty to prevent you from doing that. Whereas in the US, we've always taken more of a reasonable expectations approach, because we have our privacy considerations have arisen and grown out of sort of Fourth Amendment concerns, the government, protecting ourselves from government intrusion, what's reasonable, what isn't. In the marketplace, we've always felt that you should be able to vote with your pocketbook. And as long as companies were honest and transparent about what they were doing, then we could either choose to interact with them or not. And most of our enforcement historically has been around companies who have been dishonest or deceitful about what they're doing. Now that got shaken up a bit with some of the Facebook scandals and Cambridge Analytica and everything, because I think people realize that it's not always easy to walk away in today's world. And so for the US at least, what you're seeing is some states now, our privacy is a quilt. It's a patchwork of various different there's over 300 federal laws that address privacy in some way, and then several laws at each state and local level around the US. And what you're seeing in states like New York empowering the governor to temporarily set aside statutes, laws, and ordinances that address privacy. Now, they don't come out and say privacy by name, but that will be an impact. So what's interesting is you as a company have to be very careful about how you are impacted by government actions that sort of require you to share your information about your users with the government, presumably for good purposes, but maybe not. And I think that just as with many issues in the US, there's a deep divide in our population between people who think that there's a public health need for people to share information. They shouldn't be allowed to do certain things unless they're willing to share, versus the people in the country who think that that information, for some of the reasons that Warren spoke well about, is that it could be put to really harmful uses. So I think that, just as I said, that the pandemic has the effect of amplifying and accelerating some of these issues, I think in the future, you're going to see that this has the effect of amplifying the divides and the concerns that we've always had about privacy, forcing us to make some key decisions. David, do you have any thoughts on these issues? Again, it's too bad we don't have more time because it's pretty interesting topics.
No, it's a fascinating topic, and one that is really, I think it's going to be dominating some of the policy and political dialogue, not necessarily in the next couple of months, but in the months that follow. So right now, while we are reacting, I think government's trying to figure out what can we do right now, and then what can we do to get the economy started. But it's worth noting that before the pandemic began, states were also already starting to really have a pretty robust discussion around privacy. You had the California law, you had a task force that of course is scheduled to go into place. You've got a Texas task force, which was set up to really get ready for the next legislative session, that many Republican states were watching what was going on in Texas. You had several Democratic states watching what had happened in California. California's law was starting to have a spillover effect not only into its neighbors, but then regionally, as people were watching how the privacy expectations were changing. Now, with the pandemic, we have, as you said, a whole different set of expectations on how data needs to be used or could be used in a healthcare context, in a response context, in a track and trace context, all for fighting, the common cause of how do we get out of this mess with regard to the pandemic. That is going to be a clash of ideas: privacy versus data, safe harbors for some information, de-identified data, and how can that be used? How can we make really excellent decisions at both the state and local level unless we have the data that we need? And then ultimately, how does that get used by employers long term? You've already got other countries talking about almost passes of who's immune to this virus, if that is actually something that comes up at a later time. All of these are privacy concerns. So I do not think at the federal level, I think this is so complex that there will be a debate and a dialogue. I'm not sure where they will go legislatively, but the states who were very active before the pandemic, I think after we come out of this, states are going to have to come back to this topic. And I agree with you. Those camps may be further entrenched, but they're going to have to find a way to deal with all of this new digital information that's being developed as a result of the pandemic. So that's my initial take. This is an issue that's going to be with us for a very long time. Todd, you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think that Americans tend to be more optimistic about the potential benefits of technology in our lives. And so when it comes to pandemics and everything, we're hopeful that, we can overcome. American ingenuity can really contribute. And that really relies on data and big data. And I think that was reflected in the earlier, Silicon Valley approach, where it was, let's collect as much as we can, we'll figure out how to use it later. And that's just in really stark contrast to regions like Europe that, again, view it as a fundamental human right and are much more pessimistic about the approaches. So they say you need to know exactly why you are collecting data before you collect it, because the dangers and the risk associated with it are just too great. And I always find it a little bit ironic that a lot of the European concerns arose out of misuse of data during the World War II and afterwards by some of the security agencies. And yet under GDPR, it feels like the harshest requirements are on private companies and the governments have a lot more flexibility. But that's just, there's lots of ironies in life. But I know that we were trying to save a little bit of time for questions. And so if you had any questions you wanted to send them through the chat, I know we're almost out of time, but happy to try to take that up either now or later.
We don't currently have too much in the chat. I think it's been an excellent talk. I know from a time standpoint, we're right on it. For all of our audience members, this presentation has been recorded and will be up on our COVID-19 website and hub. If you do have follow-up questions, the contact information for this group will also be provided. Please feel free to contact us directly. I want to thank all of our panelists for both their expertise and their time today. This is an issue which I think is only going to grow in importance and debate, and it's going to be key to any employer, let alone lawmakers across the country. So for all those who've been listening to us today, thank you for joining us on this webinar. We'll have another one next week, and I encourage you to go to our COVID-19 hub for the latest updates, client alerts on legal developments, policy developments as this pandemic progresses. And from all of us at Dentons to you, your families, be safe, be healthy, be well, and we hope to hear from you next week. Thank you very much.